There was a morning that every American teenager circled on the calendar. Not Christmas. Not even graduation. The 16th birthday. Because somewhere between waking up that day and going to bed that night, a kid in 1975, in 1981, in 1988, was going to walk into the Department of Motor Vehicles as a passenger in someone else's life, and walk out as the driver of their own. Picture it. The fluorescent lights humming over a waiting room full of folding chairs. A paper number clutched in a sweaty hand. A mother or father sitting a few seats away, trying not to look nervous, failing completely. The smell of that place, floor wax, coffee from a machine nobody trusted, the particular institutional quiet of government buildings everywhere. And underneath all of it, a kind of electricity, because everybody in that room, teenager and parent alike, understood that something was about to change permanently. This wasn't just an errand. It was a rite of passage, one of the last true ones America had left, and for decades it worked almost the same way in almost every town. You turned 15, or in some states 15 and a half, and you got your learner's permit. You spent months practicing in empty parking lots and quiet subdivisions, your father's hand gripping the door handle like it might fly open, your mother pressing an invisible brake pedal into the passenger side floor mat. You took driver's ed, often right there in your high school, in a car with a second brake pedal welded onto the passenger side, driving loops around town with two other terrified classmates crammed in the back seat and an instructor up front who had clearly seen worse. And then, on or near your 16th birthday, you took the test. Parallel parking. 3-point turns. The dreaded instructor with the clipboard sitting beside you, marking down every rolling stop, every wide turn, every moment your hands weren't quite at 10 and 2. And when you passed, when that little slip of paper or that laminated card with your terrible photo came sliding across the counter, you weren't just legally allowed to drive. You had become, in the eyes of your friends, your family, and honestly yourself, a different kind of person entirely. Because here's what almost nobody talks about now. Getting your license in the 70s and 80s wasn't really about the car. It was about the door that opened behind it. Before that day, you were dependent. Somebody drove you to school, to your friend's house, to the movies, to your part-time job at the drugstore or the record shop. Your world was exactly as big as the adults around you were willing to make it. And then, almost overnight, it wasn't. You could drive yourself to school on a Tuesday morning with the windows down and the radio turned up loud enough that your parents would have said something if they'd been in the car, which was exactly the point, they weren't. You could take a girl or a boy to a drive-in on a Friday night without anybody's mom idling in the parking lot. You could pile 3 friends into a Chevette or a hand-me-down station wagon and drive nowhere in particular, just to be driving, just because you finally could. This was the era of cruising culture, of teenagers turning a stretch of boulevard into a kind of nightly parade, kids circling the same few blocks for hours, windows down, radio up, not going anywhere because the going was the whole point. None of that happens without a 16-year-old with fresh plastic in their wallet and a full tank of gas. The license wasn't a bureaucratic formality back then. It was the ignition key for an entire subculture of American teenage life, and the timeline was remarkably consistent, coast to coast, for most of this period. 16 was the number. Not 16 and a half after a waiting period, not a staged process with a dozen restrictions attached, just 16, a test, and full driving privileges, the same as any adult on the road. A kid in rural Nebraska and a kid in suburban New Jersey were, in this one narrow respect, having almost identical experiences. Turn 16. Take the test. Drive. It's worth sitting with just how universal this was, because universality is exactly what's disappeared. In 1983, something like 80% of American teenagers who were old enough to drive had a license by the time they finished high school. It wasn't a choice you weighed against other choices. It was simply what you did, the same way you got your first job at the mall or your first library card. Not having your license by 17 wasn't a lifestyle decision. It was a small social embarrassment, the kind of thing that got you teased at lunch. So what changed? The answer starts, quietly, in the 1990s, and it starts with numbers nobody wanted to look at but everybody eventually had to. For as long as 16-year-olds had been getting full, unrestricted licenses, they had also been dying in car crashes at rates far higher than any other age group on the road. Not because teenagers were reckless in some moral sense, but because the old system asked an enormous amount of a brand new driver almost immediately. Pass the test on your birthday, and by that weekend you might be allowed to drive at midnight, with 4 friends in the car, in the rain, on an unfamiliar highway, the exact combination of conditions that overwhelms even experienced drivers, handed all at once to someone with maybe 40 hours of supervised practice behind them. Traffic safety researchers started connecting the dots, and in 1996, Florida became the first state to try something different, graduated driver licensing. The idea was simple, even if the execution varied state to state. Instead of a single leap from zero driving experience to full privileges, you'd climb a ladder. A longer learner's permit stage, sometimes 6 months, sometimes a full year, with mandatory supervised hours logged in a little booklet your parents had to sign off on. Then an intermediate stage, where you could drive alone, but not everywhere and not anytime, nighttime driving restrictions, usually somewhere around 9 or 10 at night to 5 in the morning, and passenger restrictions limiting how many friends could legally be in the car with you. Only after that, sometimes not until 17 or 18, did a teenager get the same unrestricted license their parents had gotten at 16 without a second thought, and it worked. That's the part that's hard to argue with, no matter how nostalgic you feel about the old way. States that adopted graduated licensing saw teen crash and fatality rates drop significantly, in some studies by 20 to 40% among the youngest drivers. By the early 2000s, nearly every state in the country had adopted some version of it. The 16th birthday sprint to the DMV counter had been replaced, state by state, with a longer, more supervised, more cautious on-ramp to the open road. But here's where the story gets more complicated than a simple safety statistic, because graduated licensing laws only explain part of what happened next. They explain why 16-year-olds today are more restricted than their parents were. They don't fully explain why so many of them stopped wanting the license at all, because that's the real shift, the one that would have been almost unthinkable to a teenager in 1979. Today, the percentage of American 16-year-olds with a license has fallen dramatically, from that 80% range in the early 80s down to somewhere closer to a quarter of that age group in more recent years. Even by 19, the age by which nearly every teenager in the 70s and 80s was driving, a meaningful share of young people today still haven't gotten around to it. The DMV waiting room isn't the anxious, electric place it used to be, because a lot of the kids who would have filled it simply aren't showing up. Part of this is the graduated licensing laws themselves. Ironically, when the process takes longer, involves more paperwork, more logged hours, more parental sign-offs, some teenagers simply put it off, the way anyone puts off a task that's gotten more complicated than it used to be. But the deeper reasons run further than that. A teenager in 1978 needed a car to have a social life, full stop. There was no other way to get to your friend's house, your job, the mall, the movie theater, the girl or boy you were trying to impress. The car wasn't optional. It was the infrastructure of teenage existence itself. A teenager today has a phone in their pocket that can deliver most of that same social connection without anyone ever starting an engine. They can talk to their friends for hours without leaving their bedroom. They can order food, watch a movie, build a whole social world, entirely through a screen. And when they do need to physically get somewhere, a parent's schedule allowing, there's often a rideshare app standing in for the independence a license used to provide, imperfect, and not free, but available in a way that didn't exist for any previous generation. The car has quietly stopped being the only key to the kingdom, and so getting the key itself has stopped feeling urgent. There's also, underneath all of it, a broader and slower shift in how American culture treats the whole idea of growing up. The milestones that used to arrive on a tight, almost mandatory schedule, the license at 16, the first job at 15 or 16, moving out shortly after high school, have all stretched out, softened, become optional in a way they simply weren't for the generations before. Some of that is economic. Some of it is cultural. Almost all of it adds up to the same quiet truth. Adulthood doesn't arrive in a single dramatic moment anymore, the way it seemed to arrive the instant a 15-year-old in 1981 slid a freshly printed license into a vinyl wallet. And that's really what this is about, underneath the statistics and the state laws and the safety studies. Something has been lost, even if what replaced it is, by almost every measurable standard, safer. There was a particular kind of American teenage life that existed for a few decades in the middle of the 20th century, one built entirely around the idea that turning 16 meant a door swinging open all at once, rather than easing open a crack at a time over several cautious years. It meant driving your friends to a diner at 11 at night just because you could. It meant the specific freedom of an empty road, a car radio, and nobody in the passenger seat telling you where to go. That version of coming of age is mostly closed. In its place is something more careful, more supervised, and for a lot of today's teenagers, something they don't seem to be in much of a hurry to reach for at all. Maybe that's simply what progress looks like: fewer teenagers dying on the road, fewer frantic calls to parents at 2 in the morning, a longer runway before anyone hands a kid the keys to 2 tons of steel moving at highway speed. But somewhere in all that caution, the 16th birthday lost something it used to have. It used to be the day everything changed. Now, for a lot of kids, it's just another Tuesday, and the DMV waiting room, the one that used to hum with nervous, electric anticipation, sits a little emptier than it used to.